Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Tax, the show for growth-minded CPAs and real estate professionals in tax. I'm your host, Tim LeMasters, and in today's episode, we will discuss the recent increased scrutiny in international compliance and why many CPA firms are avoiding global tax. Joining Let's Talk Tax for the first time today is Jason Rauhe, principal of McGuire Sponsel's Global Business Services practice. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Tim. Good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. First time, huh?
First time.
Great. I'm glad I could be here for you. So I guess where I really like to start with you, okay, since it is your first time, if you could just do me and the audience a favor and just give us a little bit of your background. I obviously know a lot of that, but I'd like to give just an overview so people can understand where you started, your journey along the way, and where you are today. So.
Absolutely. No problem. And again, it's good to be here. So I've been in a lot of different places, a lot of different firms. Started out with the Big Four experience. A lot of college graduates come into the Big Four, and that was one of those. Worked there for about 10 years, and then decided to go off into corporate world. So did a lot of work with large companies. We're in the Detroit office, so a lot of automotive manufacturing-based companies, but also other industries. And then worked at a couple regional CPA firms in their international tax group. So just had a wide variety of experience. Been with McGuire Sponsel for about 2 years, working, as people know, with exclusively CPA firms and helping them fill that gap in the international tax world, whether it's compliance we're going to talk about or other areas that we touch on.
Yeah. Oh, great intro. Thank you. And I guess let's start with, all right, when we first started this thing, what did we originally kind of have this vision of? When it comes to international tax and working with CPAs, what was the original vision? Because what I thought it was going to be was more, consulting and transfer pricing and things of that nature. And I've noticed we had a really quick shift to compliance. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I think a lot of people thought that most CPA firms had the compliance handled. That's more what they do every day, so to speak. And so it was coming in and doing consulting and planning and what I call boxes and triangles and moving things around. And what we quickly discovered was the CPA firms just really aren't comfortable with the compliance. And we'll touch a little more, but at a high level, just the complexity, the increased scrutiny, a lot of other things that have happened in the recent years that have really caught CPA firms off guard.
Yeah. And I think why has compliance become so frustrating for CPAs and so complex? I know obviously the changes over year, but what is the kind of the key points that you would say that they focus on that's kind of gives them this little angst when it comes to international compliance work?
Yeah, I think one of the main forms we run into is a 5471. That's just one of the common forms. And back 7 or 8 years ago, those were 6 pages long. And now we've seen them upwards of 40, 50, 60 pages with different attachments and schedules. And that really changed with the TCJA in 2018. So prior to that, it was somewhat straightforward. And now it's just so complicated with different schedules and requirements. I think CPA firms just don't necessarily have the time or the resources to figure it out and get comfortable. And we'll probably touch on later, there's significant penalties that are involved if they're not complete or accurate. So between those two things, it just causes CPA firms to just pause and figure out if they have a better solution.
Yeah. So when it comes to compliance, what's stopping them just from not adhering to it? I mean, just saying, all right, we're not doing this. Well, help me understand, because I guess I don't want fear factor out there, right? I don't want to have any fear tactics, but what really stops CPAs from just saying, this is too much, we don't want to handle this? I understand forms have to be filed,
right?
But walk us through that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of CPA firms initially think they can do it, and I'm not saying that they can't. I don't think what international tax is necessarily impossible to figure out, but I think what happens is just the unknown and reading the instructions and trying to figure it out. If you're a CPA firm of 100 people and you only have 10 or 20 forms, it's just a lot of manpower to commit to learning how to do those forms completely to avoid those penalties. So it's just some of it's a resource allocation, and then somewhat of it is when we have a CPA firm that gets a penalty notice, I think that really makes them aware of these are real and not something that's just theoretical.
Well, I think the other thing is obviously compliance work. That's something you just pay for and you don't really see a return on it, right?
Right. Everything
else that we do, or most CPAs, they have all these different lines in the water that says, okay, I can save you money here if you do this, right? But when it comes to international tax compliance, other than if it's a structuring project or a setup project, obviously those we can help kind of save the bite of the apple, so to speak. But I think the biggest concern is my client's going to pay all this money and they get nothing for it, right? Other than just being compliant with the IRS.
Right.
So I guess looking at that, the big fees and the scare of the fees, is that something that you see as normal, or is there other ways for people to kind of approach this and not be so concerned about these high price tags?
I think what we find a lot with CPA firms is historically, CPA firms haven't done a very good job of building in the risk of international into their normal fee structure. So what we found in the market so far, working with firms across the country, is it's not so much that clients have a tendency to not want to pay the fees. I think CPA firms artificially don't communicate the risk and communicate the need and the complexity. And once you do that, most clients are understanding of why it costs more. And then as part of what we do is we don't just do the forms and move on. We try to look, like you mentioned, for consulting opportunities or transfer pricing if there's intercompany transactions, to try to provide more value than just the compliance and just avoiding potential penalties and risk mitigation.
Sure. But why would I pay for something if the risk is not as expensive as the cost? Help me understand that. So if I say I've got a 5471, it's wrong. What's it going to cost me?
Well, a typical 5471, probably $4,000 or so. The penalties on those can be $10,000. And what we're finding that the IRS does is they take a lot of computer technology and can calculate penalties very quickly and issue notices without even thinking about or having a human involved. So they see schedules that aren't complete, they automatically issue penalty notices. Now, you may be able to fix that fairly easily, but when clients get letters from the IRS, it creates a lot of angst in the whole system from the client through the CPA firm. So trying to avoid those, that can provide a lot of value just mentally and emotionally, if nothing else.
Sure. And something we were talking about earlier is 5472s are more expensive. Is that correct?
Correct. So 5472 penalties are $25,000 per occurrence. And just so people know a little bit, the 5472s is when you have a company outside the U.S. investing in a U.S. company, and 5471s are the opposite, U.S. investing outside. So people get a feel for what that is.
Okay. And something that comes along with those that you and I have kind of experienced here lately is transfer pricing study, correct? Another form of compliance.
Yep.
All right. And I know for years we've been talking to clients and just having these discussions about transfer pricing and something that's important. Why is it something that we're seeing more of now? Is there a reason for that? Do you see, because clients for a long time were just kind of skipping years or maybe not even doing it at all. I know there's been a couple things that have come out now that's showing us that there's some more heavily scrutinized with the transfer pricing studies, but is that the reason, or is it just people are starting to figure this thing out?
I think there's a couple main reasons. One is I think people are realizing that in transfer pricing there's a lot of planning because a lot of countries are getting aggressive, so you want to be able to plan appropriately. And then secondly, mentioned earlier that the IRS is generating notices. So what you'll get is you'll get a transfer pricing documentation notice, and it could be 2 or 3 years later. So you don't really have, maybe the people have changed over at the client, information isn't as good, it's more complicated to do later. And really the goal is if you get a notice, you want to hand the IRS your documentation study, and then they just move on to somebody else. It really can be a drag on internal resources to try to create something later, particularly if it's a couple, 3 years later.
So if you have a study in place, they see that, they move on.
Typically.
It's typically that easy.
Yep.
Wow.
Typically that easy.
I'll never forget a couple years ago, and it's funny that this happened. I called you that day. It was actually that evening because I was out to dinner with my wife. But a couple years ago, I had called you and said, hey, I was just sitting here with my wife having dinner, and we were chit-chatting with a couple guys, and one of the guys asked me kind of what I did for a living, and I was explaining to him all of our services and what we do, and one of his buddies was looking at me, and he was laughing. And I'm like, hey, is that something you're in this business? And he was like, oh, yeah. He was like, I'm definitely in that industry. And I said, well, what do you do? And he's like, I'm an IRS agent. I said, okay, well, with what? He's like, transfer pricing studies.
Yeah.
I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And back then we were talking about, okay, people probably just need these every other year. That's safe. So I asked him, I was like, hey, is this something we're going to need transfer pricing study in place every year, every other year? And he goes, you better have it every year. He's like, we're looking at these heavily now.
Yeah.
2 years after that conversation, that was February of 2021. Was it 21 or 22?
22.
February 2022. Yep. And now here we are, and we're first court case we just saw recently.
There are a lot of court cases out there, and the court cases you see are very large, multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies. Our typical client base isn't like that, but what we're finding is the smaller companies are getting hit even more frequently because of these notices that are coming out, computer-generated. So a lot of the big companies have IRS agents on at their sites, continual audit. It's a little bit different than a lot of our clients that don't have that. So they get surprise notices for somebody that owns a business gets an IRS notice with a big penalty. They just get very upset. And that's something that we try to help educate on the front end to see what could happen with their clients.
Yeah, it's interesting. And
Yeah.
So one thing I want to ask you, over the last couple of years, as you've been working with our CPA relationships, and we've been taking you out to market more and just having more conversations, what are some of the more complex areas that you feel like CPAs are bringing up more often or is it something that it's just more like a 5471, 5472?
I think it's more just what I would call what international standard compliance. They really, we've had even some CPA firms have said, I'm so glad you're here because we just don't want to deal with it. And we just would like you to just help us out and be a partner and take over. Other CPA firms come in and say, we're very uncomfortable, so can you look over our shoulder and double check and just make sure? But between compliance and then transfer pricing are the two big things. I think from a structuring perspective, that typically is something that CPA firms like to sleep at night and know that the basics are covered before they even can think about it.
Sure.
And what we find is that if they don't, a competitor down the street's going to come in with a great idea, and then you have those even more awkward conversations with your client.
Yeah, yeah. It's been interesting over the last couple of years, definitely. I would say that, going back to what we were talking about originally, when we thought this was going to be more of the consulting arm, we were dead wrong, right? And the compliance has been more, I would say, important to CPAs than the other stuff, but the rest of it's starting to come along. I'm noticing that.
Yep.
Tell me about when firms have someone internally, because I know you work with some firms, well, more than I would thought of, but I know you work with some firms that have someone internally that does international tax. What happens kind of when you engage with them? Walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a lot of times firms, they know they need an international person. And I was with 2 regional firms to be that international person. And what quickly found out in my experience is that there may not be enough work to keep somebody full-time busy in that. So they're kind of that designated person just so that they have somebody to talk to. They may want help just as much as if they didn't have somebody in the firm because they just feel totally overwhelmed. Because any question that has international in it comes to them. And they just, it's such a wide variety of questions and topics in that area that they can't know it all. And so an extra resource to fill in wherever those gaps are. That's what we try to do. Is we try to fill in the gaps. So if we talk to somebody that's an international person, they may have 15, 20 years of experience in these 4 things, but not these other 4 things. And that's where they still need help with.
Okay.
So it's really a situation where there's a lot to know, and we don't know it all either, but we try to bring resources that we can help fill in those gaps.
Yeah, because a lot of times you have people that say, well, can we do some stuff in Canada? And you're like, okay, yeah, we can help you, but we also have a referral in Canada.
Correct. Yep.
And I know we're more on the corporate side, but from an individual standpoint, we get a lot of those questions.
We do.
So, I mean, if you look across the globe, kind of how do we support from a resource standpoint? What are some of the referrals? Obviously, we don't have to give names, but how do you think that you can go across the map, say Canada, Mexico, looking at just those 2, all right, and we'll say close to home, but how do we make referrals based off that? Is that an intro, just an email intro? Is that something that you can do via conference call? How do we work that?
Yeah, so it can go a lot of different ways. So our team tries to really develop those personal relationships with a lot of what I call the main country contacts and the networks that we're in. So in those cases, it's more of a email, hey, it was good to see you at the last conference. Can you help out this client with the situation? And they're very responsive. If it's countries that aren't so much, like Africa is a good example. We run into a lot of issues with countries in Africa. That's more of reaching out to them, trying to make a contact, and then making the introduction. So it really depends, but we really try to focus on that personal touch and really knowing the people.
Yeah. When do you usually see kind of international work have an uptick? Is there a time of year that you're focused on? Is it something that, obviously I know we're getting ready to go out the relationship team. It's getting ready to get a little bit crazy.
Yep.
I know conversation-wise, it seems to make sense to have it early in the summer. Is that the case, or is it something that we can wait later in the summer to have those discussions?
I think it's good early in the summer because typically from a compliance perspective, most returns that have international compliance get extended. So really the busy season for that is August, September, October. So to kind of get everything organized, and we try to operate as if we're just part of the team. We even have clients where we literally log into their software and we're part of their process. So they know that the international part's covered and we're in their work stream.
Yeah.
It can be that, or it can be, hey, it's the day before the deadline, can you review these forms? We jump in and try to help there too. So it really is all over the map, but the sooner the better to get things organized, because typically questions come up that need to be answered that aren't just simple.
Yeah.
And so that's really important to get started.
Do you see a lot of structuring projects come up based on just review, or is it something people are reaching out and say, hey, we got a client that's getting ready to set up shop in Mexico, can you help us with a structure?
Yeah, I think we see that example fairly often, but I would call that a reactionary example because the client reached out to the CPA first. But what we found in a couple examples is where we review the compliance and then we see opportunities that we bring to the CPA that they can bring to their client as a value add. And that's what I call more of a proactive approach. So it really goes all over the map in any different direction.
So compliance can kind of be a shield, but also at the same time, we can utilize it as a sword.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's
Same with
great.
transfer pricing. It's the same concept. Protect the risk, but also look for potential value and opportunities.
Yeah. I'm going to have you dig in your brain a little bit here.
Okay.
Okay. I like to just get something just recently that's on your mind, a project that you worked on that maybe just sticks out from others.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is one, and what would we call is controversy, and that's not necessarily creating a controversy, but realizing that there have been forms in the past that haven't been filed, and we haven't really touched on that yet, but that comes up often, and so it can be a difficult conversation with the CPA firm when they realize we either missed something or it's not complete, how we approach our client. And we had one of those situations recently, and really you can talk through the points of it's complex. Maybe the communication between the client and the CPA firm weren't as clear as they should have been.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that we ask questions and we get answers, and it's not necessarily the full answer. And if CPAs don't necessarily comfortable with asking the follow-up questions, they just leave it at that. So just working through, we had a project where we figured out there were years in the past that weren't done correctly, tried to create a roadmap on what needs to be done, communicate with the CPA firm and the ultimate client. And typically, if you communicate openly, that works very well. I would say if you have new clients, that's the best time to dig into it to make sure that there wasn't something missed from the prior CPA.
Yeah.
So really, that's a kind of project that we run into fairly often, given our breadth of CPA firms that we work with. You didn't ask, but just to maybe reinforce that it's really important to stay on top of compliance. This isn't something that you just throw numbers on a form and just do the pray strategy and throw it in. I mean, you really have to make sure you understand even some of the schedules on a 5471 where there's a lot of questions, yes, no. If you answer yes or no incorrectly, that can lead down a whole different path of IRS questions as follow-up. So just making sure that you cover those off, complete them, not only accurately, but completely. And it's really important to do that. And we're here to help in whatever way we can.
Okay. And the last question I have for you, with scrutiny that we're seeing, is this new level of scrutiny here to stay?
I think it's only going to get more. I think that the compliance area is an easy way. If you think about a computer can generate a notice for a $10,000 penalty, that's a pretty good return on investment from the IRS's side. And it's the technology we have now is very easy to do that. The IRS, I think, is finally catching up with some of the new technology. So I only see it getting worse. And I think that's an opportunity for all of us to really help our clients provide that value by not having notices come in that cause heartburn and also looking for those planning opportunities.
Yeah, I would agree. So, well, Jason, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and thanks for watching. Catch us on YouTube at Let's Talk Tax Podcast or at McGuireSponsel.com for all show notes and follow-up from each episode.